I want you to listen to two excerpts. What if I told you that this was the same composer, only around 20 years apart? You'd call me crazy, or that I'm mixing up composers. But no, this is the same composer, and his name was Alexander Scriabin. The point of this video is to discern how Scriabin went from late Romanticism to true atonality and what prompted this evolution. I also hope to perhaps spark some appreciation for Scriabin's music, and furthermore, him as a composer and person. The general consensus among music historians and the like have Alexander Scriabin's musical evolution divided into three distinct artistic periods, each being characterized by different theoretical and philosophical ideas and motifs. If we want to provide an overview of these periods, it will make sense to start from the very beginning. Alexander Scriabin was born on January 6, 1872, in Moscow. His mother, Lyubov, was a trained concert pianist, a graduate of the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and by most accounts genuinely talented. She died of tuberculosis before Scriabin reached his first birthday. His father, Nikolai, was a diplomat by profession and largely absent by circumstance, spending the bulk of Scriabin's formative years posted abroad. What was left in Scriabin's immediate household was mainly matriarchal, his grandmother and aunt, who were both musicians. In this regard, Scriabin was born into a musical family, and the influence in his early life, such as his grandmother and aunt, set him on the path he'd take throughout his life. He enrolled at the Moscow Cadet School at 10, as his family had certain military expectations of him. But if his life is anything to go off of, the piano in his room proved more important to him than the military. He composed small pieces and performed them for anyone who would listen. His aunt recognized early that this is something beyond ordinary childhood enthusiasm, and by 1888 he had entered the Moscow Conservatory, studying piano under Vasily Safonov and composition under Anton Arensky. And that takes us to our first artistic period of Alexander Scriabin. From 1887 to 1903, Scriabin's early period is perhaps the most grounded in conventional romantic music, taking heavy inspiration from Chopin's music, particularly his nocturnes and preludes. The question is, though, what makes this period so interesting, and what musical elements does Scriabin build off of in his later works? However, we see the seeds for his later periods of colorful music already planted within his early works. I want you to listen to an excerpt from perhaps Scriabin's most famous piece of all time, his Etude Opus 8 No. 12 in D-sharp minor. As we can hear, this piece is quite colorful despite its tonal roots, and there is something rather unsettled and frustrated within this etude, and that is what's uniquely Scriabin and becomes more apparent in his later works. Like I said previously, this period of Scriabin is grounded in Romantic period tonality, but what makes his harmonic language particularly unique is his predilection with the dominant chord, and by extension, extending them. He piles notes on top, ninths, altered fifths, raised 11ths, 13ths. The chords become richer, more chromatic, and more harmonically dense than what was typical for the time. And one voicing in particular keeps appearing throughout the early works, the dominant 13th chord with the 7th, 3rd, and 13th stacked in fourths rather than thirds. This same voicing appears in Chopin, which is why it feels so naturally in Scriabin's early language. But according to musicologists, this exact chord is the embryonic form of what would eventually become the mystic chord, the harmonic signature of Scriabin's entire late period. These extended dominants still function as dominant chords, with the dissonances as a means to a resolution, but with Scriabin, he hangs on to the dissonance in tension. As we heard in his etude, the sound is very unstable and frustrated, and it sounds that way because of this exact reason. This is important because as this period progresses, the dominant chord is played around with more and begins to actually function less as a dominant chord and more as a color, and the intervals that make the chord dominant act more as a quality of the chord itself, rather than a problem waiting to be solved. Musicologist Peter Sabat describes this process as the dissonances being frozen and solidified into the chord, becoming structural rather than transitional. In tonal music of the 19th century, pieces get their structure from this notion of tension and release around a central key and tonic. Analysis methods such as Schenkerian analysis would fail in practice if it weren't for this paradigm. When this tension and dissonance stops resolving though, when they're frozen, the tonic loses its grip on the music. Music analyst Joseph Beer calls this the gradual prescription of the tonic, where the home key doesn't disappear per se, but rather loses its grip on the music. When we near the end of Scriabin's early period, we can observe that the music isn't as tonal as his earlier works, and the gradual proscription of the tonic is clearer. His second period is where he solidifies his unique musical language, where his style of writing and the conventions of tonal music are heavily at odds with one another. And it's also where his music begins to take philosophical influences, which is what we need to establish before getting into the music of his second artistic period. The second artistic period of Scriabin is definitely my favorite as a third-rate pianist. The music, particularly the piano sonatas of this era, are so colorful and so technically and musically difficult to play. The piece you're hearing right now, actually, his fifth sonata, Opus 53, is ranked consistently as one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire, so it's kind of an uphill battle learning this as an underclassman. And to all my Music History 2 viewers, I want to make a proposal that hopefully doesn't get shot down. I want to play an excerpt of this piece for you all, to show you some of the real-world difficulties of approaching this music, and also to show you my favorite piece of all time. For any randos watching this, I may post a video of me playing this piece, if I ever finish it, which is a giant if. To begin diving into this artistic period, we want to know what influenced Scriabin to change his writing in this profound manner, and to do that, we need to know how these influences came in his life. At this point in Scriabin's life, things aren't looking so great. He resigned from his teaching position at the Moscow Conservatory. He went through a divorce with his wife Vera, with whom he had 4 children, and he got into a new relationship with a former student, Tatiana. I'm not even going to say her last name, so...
Tatiana Fedorovna Schlözer.
By 1904, he had left Russia entirely, and then Geneva, then Italy, then France, Belgium, the US. Years of wandering, financial instability, and an almost total severance from the life he had built. By any conventional measure, this is a period of personal crisis, but Scriabin experienced it differently. He experienced it as liberation. I want to quickly talk about a philosopher relevant to this artistic period, Friedrich Nietzsche. If you're not familiar, Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher whose ideas were, to put it mildly, not small in scope. His concept of the Übermensch, the superhuman individual who transcends conventional morality, creates his own values, and imposes his will upon the world, was one of the most controversial ideas of philosophy at the turn of the century, and Scriabin happened to read him a lot. We'll see in this artistic period that this idea of the Übermensch plays a big role in his creative process and his life. He began keeping philosophical notebooks alongside his compositions during these years, and the entries grow increasingly grandiose as the period progresses. He writes himself as a figure of world historical significance. He writes of art not as expression but as action, as a force capable of literally transforming human consciousness. And eventually, he writes the phrase that has followed him ever since, "I am God," which, taken out of context, sounds like megalomania. Taken in context, however, in the tradition of Russian mysticism he was simultaneously absorbing, where the disillusion of the individual ego into universal consciousness was a legitimate spiritual aspiration, it reads somewhat differently, but we'll get to that. The point for now is that Nietzsche gave Scriabin something the Romantic tradition couldn't, a philosophical framework in which the artist isn't just a craftsman or even a genius, but a transformative force, a being whose creative will reshape reality itself. And this philosophy of transcendence needed a new musical framework to hold it. The shift is audible pretty much immediately. In his third symphony, subtitled The Divine Poem, which premiered in Paris in 1905, announced this new period of his music plainly. It's a programmatic symphony, and it is enormous in scale, and Scriabin has a poem, not written, but throughout this entire piece, that describes the evolution of the human spirit from bondage through pleasure toward divine play. And the harmonic language of the symphony is very unstable and frustrated, more so than anything he had written before. These chromatic tensions that were quietly accumulating in the late works of his earlier period are now much closer to the surface. You can hear the strain, Scriabin's new language, against its tonal roots. That is deliberate. Around 1906, something else entered the picture that influenced Scriabin's compositions again. Scriabin encountered Theosophy, which is a mystical philosophical movement associated with Helena Blavatsky. The central text of Theosophy is called the Divine Doctrine, which Scriabin owned, annotated, and read closely, though it's hard to say if he actually took Theosophy that seriously or not, but we'll get into that later. Theosophy offered a framework in which that individual will was part of a larger evolutionary arc of all existence. That the human will is a spiritual sense that encompasses not just the artist, but all of humanity, all of matter, and all of time. There are theoretical implications in the music that we can take a look at. And the piece I'm going to use is, in my opinion, the pinnacle of Scriabin's middle period, his fifth piano sonata. These changes are extremely noticeable in this piece, more so than a lot of his other middle period works. This piece is a single movement, what carries throughout the rest of his piano sonatas. And tonal harmony takes a very clear backseat in service of Scriabin's new framework of musical expression, color and delayed gratification. The reason for this, as you can guess, is philosophically informed. It's this idea that a musical work should be a single, unified impulse, rather than a collection of contrasting sections. And this mirrored Scriabin's growing belief in the unity of all things, the drive toward a single transcendental point, almost like a supernova, rather than a multi-movement work with the movement's own trajectories and plots. Here's a clip of the piece so you can hear that weaker tonality and stronger play with color. The other side of the high point of this period, the large orchestral works, are also worth talking about. Probably more so than the piano works, since they're larger in scope. His Opus 54 work, titled The Poem of Ecstasy, has much of the same play of color and delayed gratification that we heard in Sonata 5, only at an immense programmatic scale. The poem that is attached to this piece perfectly encapsulates his philosophy at the time, and the piece is not very tonal, and I don't think it will make sense to call it tonal, except for the ending. The 20 minutes of almost delirious harmonic structure and orchestration all converge into probably one of the most ecstatic and transcendental climaxes in all of music. Back to the question of Scriabin's commitment to theosophy, though. His brother-in-law, Boris de Schleuser, said himself that Scriabin didn't take theosophy that seriously, and was even disappointed by certain aspects of it. James Baker, whose analytical work on Scriabin is the most rigorous we have, largely sets his philosophy aside and focuses on what the notes are actually doing. And Richard Turiskin, reviewing both Baker and de Schleuser, argues that the two approaches can't really be separated, and that the harmonic choices are the philosophical commitments made audible. That tension between analytical and biographical is one of the most interesting open questions in Scriabin discussions, and it's worth considering rather than just jumping to conclusions on that matter. Regardless, though, we'll see in his later period, especially with his magnum opus, Mysterium, that his theosophy and mysticism clearly influenced his creative process. Prometheus, the Poem of Fire, Opus 60, premiered in Moscow in 1911, and it marks the point where Scriabin stops experimenting and commits fully to his own musical vision. The piece is built on the mystic chord, 6 notes stacked in fourths that have been surfacing quietly in his earlier works. Here, it arrives as the foundation of the entire piece, except it refuses to function like a foundation normally does. It does not resolve, and it doesn't offer the listener a home key to return to. That sense of tension releasing into stability, the basic grammar of Western music for 3 centuries, does not exist in his late period. What replaces it is a harmonic system Scriabin built himself, generated almost entirely from the mystic chord. He called it his synthetic system. And the important thing is that it's not just the absence of tonality. It's its own theory. It's its own sense of motion or arrival. The late sonatas and orchestral works that follow develop it consistently enough that it functions as a genuine musical language rather than, controlled chaos. Prometheus also introduces something harder to categorize, a part written for what's called a color organ, an instrument designed to project colored light onto the concert hall walls in sync with the music, with specific colors mapped to specific pitches. Scriabin believed sound and light were expressions of the same underlying spiritual reality, and that a truly complete work of art had to engage both simultaneously. It was the first serious attempt at multimedia composition in the Western music sphere. The lights weren't used at the premiere, and have rarely been realized since, but their presence in the score reveals exactly where Scriabin's head was at. Not just toward a new harmonic language, but toward a new conception of what music could be, a multimedia experience. The late piano sonatas, numbers 6 through 10, all composed between 1911 and 13, are where the new harmonic language is most concentrated and most uncompromising. They abandon key signatures entirely. They are all single movements for the reason I have previously stated, and they're harmonically dense and volatile, often violent in their texture, and they operate without the safety net of any tonal center to orient the listener, like a key signature. Sonata number 8 is the most intellectually rigorous of the late sonatas. It's the longest, the most harmonically complex, and the most patient. Where others achieve intensity through speed and intensity, the 8th builds through density, a slow accumulation of layers that feels inevitable. Scholar James Baker identifies it as one of the clearest demonstrations of the internal coherence of Scriabin's late harmonic system. The mystic chord and its derivatives aren't surface color here, they're structural. And crucially, the climaxes themselves are fully atonal. There is no tonal system or tonal music to resolve to, and there's no gesture towards the conventions he had long since abandoned. Sonata number 9, known as the Black Mass popularly, goes somewhere darker. It opens on a tangle of strangely placed intervals, moving up and down chromatically. building toward one of the most violent climaxes in his entire catalog. The title Black Mass wasn't Scriabin's own. It was coined by critic Leonid Sobyanin, who heard something ritualistic and sinister in the music. Whether Scriabin intended that reading hardly matters. It's not hard to hear why it stuck. This is the piece that opened the video, paired against the prelude. Hearing it again now, the distance between those two works should feel different. Not a contrast between two composers, but the ends of a very long and eccentric journey. We cannot go on and finish this video without talking about Vers la Flamme. Vers la Flamme, Opus 72, was composed in 1914, 1 year before Scriabin died. It's not a piano sonata. It carries no subtitle or programmatic text with it, and it is one of the most texturally innovative and violent in his repertoire. This piece actually has a story to it. Vers la Flamme means toward the flame, and it gives a horrifying visual of the end of the world as it burns in flames without compromise. And this piece, much like Piano Sonata 8 and 9 and Prometheus, is a pillar of this period. He was working on the Mysterium when he died in April of 1915, a 7-day multimedia ritual intended to be performed in India, involving music, poetry, dance, color, scent, and touch, culminating in the literal transformation of human consciousness and the end of the world as a material reality. He left only sketches, and there was no music written for it yet. He died of sepsis from an infected lip, aged 43, with, in my opinion, the largest ambition in the history of Western music still unrealized on his desk. I guess the sort of thesis of this project is that this profoundly dramatic evolution from his early Chopin-esque preludes to the Mysterium is influenced almost completely from his own religious philosophies. We saw that his single harmonic idea with the dominant 13th chord gave way to a completely original way of writing music. And we saw that his obsession with Chopin and his readings of Nietzsche led to a way of thinking about music that pushed the bounds of what was thought possible.